Hello, welcome to our Unit 2 notes, Tighter British Control. Today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that plant the seeds for the American colonist to begin to want to break away from England and start the American Revolutionary War. Let's begin our story by talking about the French and Indian War. This takes place in the American colonies between 1754 and 1763. It's a war fought between France and England. Now, basically, the winner of this war is going to have control over the North American continent. And fortunately for us, the English win in 1763, but the war was extremely expensive. And the English now need to find a way to both protect the colonies and also pay for the war that they just fought. So, in 1763, the Crown issues a very controversial law called the Proclamation Line of 1763. Now, if you look at this map, you'll see the red line that runs across basically the mountainous region on the East Coast here. This line is the Proclamation Line of 1763. The king stated that no American colonist could settle on the western side of the Proclamation Line. Part of the reasoning for this was it was extremely expensive to defend this large piece of land. We have to kind of remember and think about the fact that the American colonies were about 5 times the physical size of what England was. So there's some serious difficulties in trying to maintain an army and defend an area this large. So this is another picture of the map. You can kind of see where some of the major American colonial cities are at this point. And again, the red line depicts the Proclamation Line of 1763. Now, on the other side of those mountains is some really good farmland. And so the colonists, who helped the English win this war against the French, really wanted to be able to expand further to the west and go over the mountains. Of course, Britain says, no, we want you to be able to just stay on the eastern side of the Proclamation Line, again, partially because it's just too expensive to defend this large mass of land. So we have a conflict here between the colonist and the king. Now, many of the colonists do decide to move across the mountains anyway. This line is extremely difficult to enforce. You can't really have soldiers along the entire ridge of the Appalachian Mountains. So many people do ignore this law and do move across the Appalachian Mountains into the lands west. Now, the king does have 10,000 soldiers stay in the American colonies after the French and Indian War. And this is also something that kind of begins to worry the colonists, because why do you have 10,000 soldiers staying in the colonies? What are they defending against? There's no longer a threat from the French. The American colonists, especially those in the cities, Boston, New York, areas like that, become very suspicious of, first of all, why the king would want these 10,000 troops to stay in the American colonies. And then also, this is going to be another added expense. They were talking about all the money that they had to pay back after the French and Indian War. Now they're going to incur even more expenses by having these soldiers stay in the colonies. So in 1763, the king issues something known as the Quartering Act. Now, the Quartering Act requires colonists to house or quarter British soldiers. This is obviously going to save England a lot of money. A lot of times we think of this as the soldiers knocking on your door saying they need a place to stay. But in reality, this falls on the burden of the cities. For example, Boston has to find a place for these soldiers to stay. Many times they find public barns, public buildings to put the soldiers in. The problem is this also costs the cities money. So even though the colonists themselves are not paying a direct tax for this, because the city that they live in is having to come up with these supplies and come up with these places for the soldiers to stay, it's an indirect tax on the people. It's still costing them money. It's just not directly coming out of their own pockets. Now, shortly after that, the English crown decides to issue another act called the Sugar Act. This is in 1764. I do have a picture here of a jar of sugar, but in many cases the larger impact of this is on large barrels of molasses that typically is used to eventually create rum. Okay. Now, there have been taxes on sugar and molasses before. The problem is when this comes about in 1763, there's a lot of economic hardship. The economy is really bad anyway. And the people that are affected by this are the shippers in the colonies, because when they are bringing in molasses to make rum, they are claiming they don't really have that much of a margin to make money off of each of those barrels. And now by having to pay a tax, it's really going to hurt their business. And it's mainly going to hurt the American business people, and it's going to help people down in, for example, the West Indies that don't have to pay this tax. So again, this is what we would call an indirect tax. The people are not specifically paying this tax out of their pocket, but anytime they buy something like rum or anything that has these sugar and molasses in it, they're obviously paying the tax because their price is going up. Now, they also had a very strict punishment for smugglers. If you did not pay the tax, you could get put in prison, in some cases even be killed for trying to smuggle in sugar or molasses that did not have tax paid for it. The next act becomes a direct tax on the colonist, and this is called the Stamp Act. This happens in 1765. This requires all legal and commercial documents to carry an official stamp that shows that a tax had been paid. This is basically anything that's a piece of paper, a will, a newspaper, a deck of playing cards, any kind of legal document if you're exchanging land, for example. Anything that has documentation that is paper, you have to pay a direct tax on. So this is a much different tax for the colonist. They are specifically paying this tax, and to make it even more difficult, they also have to pay not with paper money, which is what most people paid with. They have to pay with gold and silver. And these are rare commodities in the colonies. We don't actually mine silver and gold in the colonies. So this puts an extra burden on people that when you pay this, you have to have gold or silver on you to pay for it. Here's some examples of some stamps that they used on the Stamp Act. And it's also important to note here, the punishment if you got caught counterfeiting a stamp could result in death. So a pretty serious deal if you're trying to counterfeit for the Stamp Act. Now, this is again happening in 1765. English Parliament voted this in, but there is no representation from any of the colonists in Parliament. So another reason why the colonists are upset, not just because they have to pay it, but because they begin to see this as the beginning of a process where they have no say in the taxes that are affecting them. It's all happening on the other side of the ocean in England. So what do the colonists do? They begin to organize and protest. One of the things they do to protest is called a boycott. When you boycott an item, you simply refuse to buy the goods that are being taxed. So wherever possible, they decide to not buy sugar. They decide to not buy things with molasses. They make decisions not to have paper documents whenever possible. Here's a picture of a protest happening. This is from a colonial newspaper. Another thing that happens after the attacks is the Sons of Liberty are formed. The Sons of Liberty are a secret group that begins to meet. You can see their flag there on the right-hand side, the red and white stripes. They begin to organize protest. This is not just something that people randomly do. They begin to organize how people boycott things. They have protests in the streets against the taxes. They are a very public voice against having these taxes placed on the colonists. Here's a meeting of the Sons of Liberty, again, a secret meeting, so you had to be careful not to let the British officials know who was in the Sons of Liberty. And Parliament responds in 1766 by repealing, or basically doing away with, the Stamp Act. So all the pressure that the colonists placed on England by boycotting and by protesting worked, and the British Crown decides to do away with the Stamp Act. But at the same time, they state that they still have supreme authority over the colonies, and they issue a warning that says that they will have taxes that are going to follow. So this is a very significant thing for the colonies because the British Crown has given in to some of their protest. So what do you think is going to happen the next time the American colonists have a tax they don't like or some kind of legal thing from the Crown that they don't like? They're going to protest because it worked the first time against the Stamp Act. They're going to do it again. So this is just the beginning of the story on the American colonists protesting. We're going to find out in the next section about some of the other things that are taxed and how the American colonists decide to respond. Thanks. That is Unit 2 Notes, Tighter British Control.